So my name is Christian Beckwith. I'm the Executive Director of Shift. We're a 501c3 based in Jackson, Wyoming. We're dedicated to the advancement of nature as a social determinant of health. And with our Health and Nature webinar series, we're exploring the health and nature movement from the perspectives of our various stakeholder groups. Today's episode marks the start of our conservation chapter, which examines the ways that nature as a public health intervention strategy can create an implicit argument for nature itself. Upcoming chapters will feature presentations from the perspectives of land management and outdoor recreation, all in the lead up to the Shift Summit in October. You can also go back to our YouTube channel and you'll find chapters 1 and 2. The first chapter looked at the health and nature movement writ large, and chapter 2 was public health, nature as an intervention strategy. And we were looking at nature from the perspective of healthcare providers and practitioners. Of course, I would like to thank our sponsors, the National Park Service and All Trails. We're very happy to report that Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Parks opened up here in our backyard this past week. So we've seen an uptick in traffic. There's certainly some mixed emotions about it, but overall, we're really excited to get our parks back up and running. We're also excited to have All Trails on board. So if you're not familiar with All Trails, they're an outdoor recreation app that helps connect people to the outdoors, which helps them in turn achieve both mental and physical health. They are the most trusted and used digital guide to the outdoors. They're also home to the largest collection of detailed hand-curated trail maps and trail reviews and photos on the web. It's a navigation app that helps users find and navigate trails, get driving directions, plot out routes, and share them with friends and family. So thank you both to the National Park Service and All Trails for the work that they do and for making this webinar series possible. So today I'm very happy to announce that we are switching up our format, and we're inviting somebody who has been pivotal to our organizational decision to focus on the intersection of health and nature to moderate. So in her book, The Nature Fix, which if you have not read, I encourage you to run out and buy your copy today. Florence Willams explains why nature makes us happier, healthier, and more creative. But can it make us better stewards as well? So to help us answer that question, we've invited 3 fellows of our Emerging Leaders program to join us in a conversation about the ways the next generation of environmental leaders are working toward both public and planetary health. So Florence, in addition to being the author of The Nature Fix, is a journalist, a podcaster, a contributing editor at Outside Magazine, and a freelance magazine writer. She's also the writer and host of 2 Gracie Award-winning Audible original series, Breasts Unbound and The 3-Day Effect, as well as Outside Magazine's Double X Factor podcast. She's a fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature and a visiting scholar at George Washington University. Her work focuses on the environment, health, and science. And The Nature Fix, if you have not read it, was both an Audible bestseller and named a top summer read by J.B. Morgan. So thank you, Florence, for joining us and agreeing to moderate today's discussion. We also have with us Juan Lazo Bautista, and so Juan was a fellow of the 2019 Emerging Leaders Program. He's the program outreach coordinator for the Environmental Leadership Program, where he leads outreach, recruitment, and programming for the program's Pacific Northwest, and Great Lakes Regional Fellowships. Previously, he served as a resource assistant with the USDA Forest Service through the Hispanic Access Foundation, supporting partnership development with the Office of Conservation Education. He's a graduate from the University of California, Berkeley, where he received a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies with a focus on environmental sustainability and indigenous transnational organizations. He's a certified forest bathing guide, leading walks with the intention of helping people grow their connection to nature and place through sensory experiences of their environment. With us as well as Ciarra Greene. She was a 2016 Emerging Leaders Program Fellow. She's Native Environmental Science faculty with Northwest Indian College, Nez Perce site. She's a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe. Nimipu, Nez Perce culture and traditions emphasize environmental stewardship, and they drive Ciarra's academic, professional, and personal endeavors. Ciarra has her BS in chemistry from Northern Arizona University. She earned her MS degree in science teaching at Portland State University in 2019. She currently serves on the Nez Perce Tribe General Council Resolutions Committee and is a contractor for curriculum and program development focusing on culture and the STEM fields. In 2019, she was awarded the $10,000 ShiftX Fellowship Fund grant for Nimpunuit, Lifeways of Our Homelands. Did I get that right? A collaboration, more or less, a collaboration between the Nez Perce Tribe and local academic institutions and agencies to promote the restoration and conservation of our Nez Perce homelands. So welcome, Ciarra. Thanks for joining us this morning. We also have with us from the great state of Wyoming, Jess Johnson. She's the advocacy and legislative liaison for the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. She's also a founding member and sits on the advisory council board of National Wildlife Federation's Sports Women's Coalition, Artemis, which is a women's group focused on changing the dialogue and stereotypes placed on the hunting and angling community and encouraging women to take leadership roles in conservation and wildlife-related positions. So in 2018, Jess, along with Mateen Hassami of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, received the inaugural $10,000 ShiftX Fellowship Fund grant for their hunting and fishing mentorship program proposal, which recruited 20 university students with an emphasis on women and immersed them in a year-long conservation and subsistence development program. Thank you, Jess, for joining us here this morning. And this presentation, as with all of our presentations, is being recorded for later distribution via our Slack channel, which you can find at Shift Nature Health, as well as on our YouTube channel. We do build these episodes to be interactive. So we encourage you, if you're joining us here today, to use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, to serve up any questions that you might have for the moderator or our panelists this morning. And we will get to them at the about the halfway mark of today's presentation. So I am going to turn this over to, Florence, and I am going to go offline and leave it to you.
Okay, thanks, Christian. I'm a huge fan of Shift, and I'm honored to be here. You know, I love Shift's focus on health and access to nature. Today's topic is more sort of oriented towards conservation, but of course I feel that conservation and public health and individual health are incredibly interlinked, right? So there's been a lot of research showing that the more connected people feel to nature, the more inclined they are to want to be stewards of the land and to take care of it. And of course, without the sort of mental health and a healthy state of mind and a heart filled with love and connection for the natural world, there won't be the inclination to even go out into it. Of course, we're living in really stressful times right now, especially challenging a lot of our mental health and our collective health. So I'm interested in kind of steering part of the conversation to that. But I wanted to start just even by examining the term conservation. I'm really excited by our panelists today and young leaders, and I know they have a lot to say about this word. So I'm really interested to hear from each of you about what the word conservation means, because it does mean different things to different people. I'm interested in what it means to you sort of linguistically as a word, and also what it means to you practically speaking on the ground in your communities. So maybe Juan, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi everyone. Good morning. I think conservation for me has changed as I've learned more about myself. And so in the way that you mentioned, Florence, how conservation can definitely mean a lot of different things. Over time, I've realized that conservation means also my well-being. So traditionally, I've understood conservation as taking care of our environment, taking care of the natural surroundings that have filled me with so much joy as I hike, as I bike, as I run. But also over time, I've realized the connection that I have with these places and the emotional ties that I have that in turn have allowed me to look more at the reciprocity of how do I give back to places that have given me so much in the same way that I give back to communities that have given me so much. And so in conservation, I find different emotions that I go back to, feelings of If I can take care of this land the way it's taking care of me, then hopefully we can take care of others. And so I think all those interconnected pieces give me the sense of conservation and what that entails as to my work and to why I do it.
Thanks. Ciarra, let's go to you.
Yeah, so growing up, you know, we never really had that word conservation talked about at the dinner table much, but we did talk about protection and healing. And so for me, that's really where conservation comes from, is protection. And not just protection of the land, but protection of this sacred relationship that extends since time immemorial. And that sacred relationship is also bi-directional. So it's not just us, you know, protecting the land is also protecting and taking care of us. And so for me, that's really where conservation, that's at the heart of conservation. But over the years, I've come to realize that this word has so many ties back into history that are actually dismissive of that sacred relationship. And so I think that's important for folks who especially work in the conservation field or public health or anything related to the environment, really, is to understand the history of words and policies that have come about in regards to conservation. So the pristine wilderness that conservation has been founded on, you know, this idea of conservation in America really removed the human aspect, and, you know, burning of landscapes and hunting, killing these beautiful wild animals were things that were frowned upon from a traditional, I guess, conservation standpoint in the early days when this movement started. And really the landscapes that colonizers came to recognize and find beautiful had been managed and maintained for millennia. And so I think really just understanding conservation before colonization is something that everyone should take a minute to look into. So there's some good articles out there, especially just about national parks and conservation ideas. So that's what the foundation is, though, protection.
Thank you. And Jess?
I think I'm continually amending and changing what my definition of conservation is. And I think all three of us, in one instance or another, has used the word reciprocity, which is the one that sort of always sifts to the top of my list on what I feel like it is and how I experience conservation. But then I have where my job title is with advocacy and legislative, where I've seen a lot of what we would call conservation laws and the writing behind it either be put into act or to have been chipped away at. And so there's the action and the advocacy behind the conservation, which also lends itself to my definition. And then I think, you know, from the direction of where a lot of my work is focused, which is broadening the definition of conservation. And I have a feeling I'm going to learn a lot from Ciarra in this. But, you know, hunters and anglers typically use conservation as a crutch and an excuse of why it's okay to do what we do, rather than telling stories. And so they say, you know, hunting tags pay for conservation, they pay for land or wildlife management. And that's been one of the biggest mistakes I think hunters and anglers have made in relying on that definition to say what their relationship with nature is. And so mine has sort of a three-pronged approach, and I would say the very heart of it, the way that I feel and what I look at conservation as, is that reciprocity. It's my health, it's the health of the life cycle and the land cycle that I'm part of, and it's also what drives my interaction with hunting.
Nice, thank you. I just want to tell our viewers too that we do have questions that we're going to be giving to the panelists from you all. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A tab down there, and you can type questions into there, which I can convey to them. And I'll also be monitoring the chat stream as well, if that's easier. So, you know, you all work with young people. And you see that as really fundamental, I think, to forging this critical connection, right? That's not only important for individuals, but important for really protecting the land as well, ultimately. And I'm curious to know if there's sort of a critical window that you see for forging this connection. Is there a certain age group that you feel is really important to reach?
I can take a stab at that. You know, I think, and again, I'm coming from the background in the hunting industry and a lot of the hunting and angling nonprofit sort of work. We have seen a huge focus on youth, so kids, and I love that, and I think it's an incredible thing to start that. I'm beginning to think that the most important sort of age group and window is in the young adult, in someone who is a little more independent, has maybe a little more flexibility to do their own schedule, have a little bit of spending money, whatever it is that gives that little bit more of independence and know thyself kind of, and has autonomy over themselves. I'm beginning to feel like those are the people that we are going to see change the tide in a lot of this. And I say that because these are the people who will potentially be parents and start raising families into this different, whether it's a different mindset or different learning about conservation and hunting and angling. And I think if you hit that, we're going to see an uptick that goes faster than the general curve of when we're just working on educating youth. Because if we are only educating youth and forgetting the parents of that youth, I think it's a no-go. It'll stop at 4th grade as opposed to be carried on.
Great.
Yeah, I think as well, our approach is really community-based, and so we have the elders intertwined with the teaching, and our focus is also the adults, only because I've worked so much with youth and having camps. The adult chaperones or counselors are, you know, elbowing their way to the front to hear the opportunities and hear the knowledge and see what's going on and get their hands wet and dirty and do all the things that kids are. And I've heard so many times, you kids better appreciate this because we didn't have this when we were kids. I'm thinking it's never too late. You know, we can have camps for adults to learn this as well. Because like you're saying, Jess, it's, you know, the adults can carry this on. They can bring their kids out to do these things. They can really carry that forward. And for us in our Native communities, we have a long history of with the boarding schools and assimilation and things like that. For us, there's been a diminishment of cultural teachings carried on forward. And so, yes, we have youth programs. In our community, we saw this lack of adult programs. And so we're really targeting the adults who can then teach their children and reinforce those ideas that the children are learning at their camps, and they can have that connection. And now we've opened up our programs to community-wide, so families can come and do these things together and really learn together, and then be able to go out to these sacred locations on our homelands, and that can be, they can start building those relationships with those land places again.
Yeah, and I think in similar thread from what I've noticed in my forest bathing experience, I've noticed that when asking questions of what does this remind you of, what does this experience bring back memories of, it usually tends to be back when I was a child, or feelings of when I was playing with mud or dirt and things like that. And so I think those visceral ideas come to mind because those are the times when we were perhaps most free to a certain degree, free of perhaps judgment or feelings of, is this the right thing to do? Am I wearing the right thing? Will I be able to do the next thing that I want to do, right? And so I think maybe carrying that similar feeling throughout all of our work will be important. Part of what I'm hoping to do with forest bathing, forest therapy guiding, is to restore that feeling of freedom and to give ourselves that permission to be who we want to be. And I think part of that is just tuning into those feelings that are innate to us. And so when kind of targeting a certain age, I find that in our history as a species, it's been usually those earlier years. And also given the different structures that are in place now, I feel like that is more of an intergenerational approach now that we have to take, where it's not just the child who can make the decisions on their own now, it's more about the parent, the caregiver, as well as those folks who are being mentors to them, maybe perhaps grandparents. So yeah, I think maybe childhood would definitely be a good place to start.
Well, that's good. I love those answers because you really gave 3 different answers. And I think that gives a lot of hope for a lot of opportunity, frankly, you know, to reach across the age span and to have this kind of intergenerational approach as well. So I mean, we started out talking about language, and I think a lot of our viewers are really, a lot of them are land managers. They're people who care about messaging. And I would like to hear from you all about the kind of messaging that you find is most inspiring, really, to your communities, both to achieve these public health goals, but also the conservation goals. And Jess, I know that you represent hunters and anglers in Wyoming. I think a lot of people tend to think of that as kind of a homogeneous state. What do you do to sort of shake up the dominant narrative and make room for inclusivity there?
Well, I think, you know, historically, the hunting and angling industry and nonprofit world has spoken very masculinely and very, they leave out the whole story. And I've found, and actually because of an experience I had at Shift at the Emerging Leaders program, I've started and focused very, very hard on telling stories in a connected and emotional way and a vulnerable way. I think hunting is viewed as something that's done with a lot of ego in the industry, and I think that provides a divide immediately. It draws a line in the sand. Whereas coming to hunting from a place of vulnerability, of understanding that it is an incredibly complex experience to take an animal's life in exchange for sustenance for you and your friends and family and community, and how that feeds into the larger sort of conservation structure of our government right now. It's a really complex story to tell, and rather than attack it from this, I went out and I shot a deer, and my hunting tag paid for conservation, therefore, I'm a good hunter. I think the story of your experiences and coming at it from an individual sense, I'm only trying to tell my story, and if my story is what resonates, then I'm really proud of that, and I would be remiss to tell others' experience in that. However, I find a lot of commonality when you start talking with hunters around a campfire. Everybody has these feelings around it. It's just the ability to communicate it. And so I think teaching storytelling and teaching that connectedness to it is very important. And rather than relying on facts and numbers and statistics, because the way that our brains work, that's not what changes our heart. What changes your heart is the relatability and the ability to see yourself in another. And that happens through a good story.
I think the storytelling component is super important, and thanks for bringing that up. And Ciarra, I'm interested in the stories that you have around messaging with food sovereignty, and how I'm wondering if that concept has really challenged land managers to do things differently.
Yeah, so a couple points here. When talking with our community, of course, the way I write a grant is very different than the way I talk with our community. If I came to our community and said, we're going to do these events to promote food sovereignty, and we're going to do these events for outdoor recreation, they might think, where do I fit into that? But when I come to our community and start talking about culture and our traditional foods and gathering and homelands, this is language that our community recognizes and appreciates. And so when I was in Portland, Oregon, the food sovereignty issue was very interesting for urban Native community. where it's a very diverse populations of natives, but still wanting to have that connection to the homelands of the indigenous populations there. And so, you know, we're all on indigenous land. So I just want to make that point clear. Whether you're in an urban setting or in a rural setting, if you're on a reservation or not, the indigenous homelands that we're all occupying currently is something to take a moment to recognize. And in Portland, there was a group, the Native American, sorry, I'm getting all my acronyms mixed up, the Native American Community Advisory Council for Portland Parks and Rec, Metro, the regional land managers, and getting access to gathering traditional foods on public lands was something that they had a long-standing relationship building and discussions about, you know, how can this move forward for the Native community to gather on public lands. And as the years went on, the community was able to gather camas, one of the traditional roots that was very prominent throughout the Northwest and even over into Montana. And gathering camas was a community event. It was a beautiful thing. But it came, when I moved to Portland, I started asking these questions with my background in chemistry. You know, how is the land being managed? And are they spraying, you know, pesticides and herbicides, and having knowledge in wetlands and the jobs of what roots have? You know, their job is to uptake these things out of the water that's passing through. And so, yes, they were spraying. And so I thought, you know, maybe we shouldn't be eating this. You know, if is it really access if it's not edible, if we're not able to use it in the way that we were meant to. And so it came up with a lot of these questions, and we did some testing, and there's continual programming around this and testing cattails that are also gathered at this site. And when thinking about food sovereignty in this, you know, if we're able to supply our own food and from the land in a safe manner, I mean, those are a lot of considerations to have, but it really comes back to these foundations of our responsibility to the land, our relationship with the land, the reciprocity that we have, and then the respect first and foremost. And so with all those things tie up, I mean, there's really, it's really hard to go the wrong way when you have these four strong pillars that you're standing on.
Thank you, Ciarra. And Juan, what about you? What kind of messaging do you find really resonates with your community?
I think storytelling has always been one of the strongest, most impactful forms of communicating. In forest bathing, we kind of use this hero's journey, kind of story arc to create an experience. We begin with the ordinary, meaning our everyday lives, and how that plays out. And then in our kind of journey, in our walk, we move from the ordinary into the extraordinary, into the adventure phase, which is kind of exploring these aspects of ourselves that perhaps we weren't aware of because we were in more of the monotony of the day-to-day. And in this kind of adventure, we find perhaps new truths about ourselves, these stories that we tell about ourselves. And so in talking about stories, we also, I like to think about them as how I refer to myself, or what I think about myself and my own lifestyle. And so when returning into the ordinary, we have perhaps a new set of understandings about ourselves and our environment. And in connecting those, hopefully, we begin to reframe the stories that we say about our environment and how those connect with the stories of ourselves. And I think that messaging has been really effective for a lot of folks in my community who understand this, not about conservation in the sense of science and how it's going to protect or prevent deforestation, for example. I think those things can be a little bit difficult to grasp, but more about the story of ourselves and how we connect with the environment around us.
Nice. We're going to switch to audience questions soon, but before I do that, I wanted to just pivot to our kind of moment in time right now, our historical moment, our mental health crisis moment, where we're facing a global pandemic, stress levels are incredibly high. People are literally isolated. They're feeling metaphorically isolated. There's a lot of division, even in the same community. Something like 26% of Americans considers themselves to be lonely, and that's before the pandemic. And now that apparently has increased another 25%. I've also heard that when people feel connected to nature, they feel less lonely, and they also feel more connected to each other. So I think in a lot of ways, nature right now is having a moment where people are realizing that it represents a kind of urgent biophilia, that we need it and we need it now. And I'm wondering, in your communities, what kind of lessons you've seen that might apply to the rest of us in terms of gathering, in terms of collectively experiencing nature. Is this something that you have something to tell us?
Yeah, I'll go first. From personal experience, first of all, I took a year and a half where I just traveled and wrote my master's thesis. And so I was staying out on, camping out on Forest Service and BIA lands all over the Western states. And although I have a device and of course a laptop that I was typing away on, I would get lonely, right? This human lonely. And I was sitting by a campfire one night, me and my dog sitting there thinking, man, am I lonely? Do I wish should I go home? But really this is what I needed, to write this 100 some odd page thesis. And sitting there, I started thinking, what an insult to all of the beings around me to say that I'm lonely. These rocks that are ancient, full of wisdom, the soil that my feet are upon, all these plants, the animals, the bats that I can hear and see flying around. How dare I say that I'm lonely when I'm surrounded by beautiful relatives? And so to me, that, that was a turning point where now when I feel lonely, even I can be in a city and feel lonely, I find that tree, I find that rock, I find a relative that I know. I always say, nature never lies. And, find these things that are going to really ground me. I mean, really, literally ground me to the earth and give me that sense of, they've been here for how many years. And for me to say that I'm lonely in their presence is an insult. And so really it helps me reframe how I'm thinking. And it's not so much, sometimes I don't need human contact. I need to be grounded.
I think in that same strain, I live in a rural town in central Wyoming, so I'm very lucky where I have expanses of accessible land right out my back door. And when the weirdness of what's happening right now and the stress and the sort of disconnectedness feeling from the rest of my community, it hasn't had as much of a mental impact as I imagine it would have if I was in a place that I couldn't do that. And so I recognize that there's a privilege there in being able to walk out your back door and do that. But I also see it in maybe the feeling of independence and sort of being able to provide for self, or to be sort of answering only to self when you're outdoors. And it's turkey hunting and bear hunting seasons, and being outside and providing food, or where the things that I'm worried about are, is it going to rain? Do I have, shelter, food, water, is very freeing, as opposed to when I find myself inside and I'm wondering about if I can pay my bill, or what healthcare is going to look like, or things like that. And I always find this thing where I'm there's culture reality, and then there's reality. And culture reality tells me I need to be really worried about bills, and then reality is you have shelter, food, and water, you're fine. And I wonder if for those of us that can't get out and can't ground ourselves in that, if doing things, whether it's planting some seeds in little egg cartons with dirt and sprout to create your own little bit of ground to just remind you that you can grow your own food, or you can provide for yourself, even if it's a small little bit, even if it's just, you know, I learned how to make a shelter today or something like that, where you're realizing that you're autonomous and independent and you can take care of yourself. I think nature teaches us very well, because it's, you know, instant reaction to any action, but it teaches us how to take care of ourselves.
It's interesting. Recently, my dad really got into gardening again, and it's kind of funny to see how much joy he gains from that. And maybe this isn't surprising, but it's a little surprising to me, because in the time that I've been part of his life, it's been more about him taking care of me, taking care of his kids, taking care of his family. And so there's been a bit of a shift as far as how he takes care of himself and what he finds joy in, and how that in turn affects the relationship that I have with him and that he has with his family. A couple of months ago, we went to the National Forest before any of this happened, and we had gone with my mom, my dad, and this is the first time me taking them as an adult, more or less. And, you know, I even got in the driver's seat and I took them both. And by the time we got there, it'd been about a 2-hour drive. And it was a really interesting experience to see my dad take off his shoes and just walk barefoot, just through beautiful forest land. And both realizing the moment and realizing that we were sharing this as a family was an incredible opportunity for me to realize how much this was affecting him in such a positive way, and perhaps how much he missed it. And so in the time right now where I find myself without really the opportunity to do that for myself, I realized how important it is. So it's almost a case of, you don't know what you have until it's gone. And so I'm thinking that a lot of people are having perhaps similar experiences right now, where they find themselves missing something. And I think a lot of times that something is just outside time, nature, that connection to our older selves, who we may not have explicitly noticed, but now it's becoming more and more noticeable.
I love those answers. You know, I live in Washington, D.C., and I think you have all just given me some useful tips. Actually, one of our listener questions was about tips for people in these times who live in places where parks are closed. And I think you all said it really well. You know, find something to grow, find a tree, find something beautiful that's sensory, take your shoes off. I think that there are really simple ways that we can connect with nature. I like to tell people to look at the sky, you know, look at the moon, look at the sunset. No matter where you are, you can look up. And then you have this feeling that we're all sort of under the same sky together, which is also a really important message that we need to feel right now, that we're sort of in this together, right? So I think that's a good segue to other questions. We have a question from Kitty Stoner, who is in Maryland probably, and has been very involved in a wonderful organization called Nature Sacred. And she wants to hear from Ciarra about how you define the word sacred. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So for me personally, the word sacred means things that carry light. And so in our teachings and our belief, you know, all things created from Haniwat, the creator or God, whichever you may call the entity, carries a light. And so for us, things that are sacred carry a light. And so right now I'm looking out my window at the cedar fence, and you know, yeah, it's wood, but it's cedar wood, and at one point that did have a spirit and did carry a light. So for some, they might just say, oh, it's a fence, you know, no big deal, whatever, not think about it. But for me, you know, that fence is sacred because at one point it did have a light. And so for us, things that come from the earth, things that are created from Haniwat, the creator, are considered sacred. And a lot of these really great things that we have, like synthetic Gore-Tex, things like that, not so sacred, but are still great things to have. So that's my short answer.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions here that I'm going to sort of combine because they're similar. One is from Josh Kuntz and from Ann Chadwick. And Anne says that she worries that many people consider conservation a luxury. Do you have advice on getting youth involved in conservation work? And then Josh says, it seems that a substantial segment of outdoor users are unaware of conservation efforts or just not that interested. So what do you see as the most significant barriers to entry for getting more outdoorsy people involved in conservation? So basically, how do we make conservation more appealing? Jess, you're on mute if you're talking.
I think conservation has an uphill battle when it comes to the language that we've given it. Everything from, I think, the word conservation to the word steward separates us from nature. You know, it says, we talk about conservation being a luxury because we talk about it as, are you a steward of the land? Which for me sounds like, are you responsible for the land under which is in your ownership or, you know, in front of you or your backyard? And that implies this immediate separation and this sort of need for deep education to even care about a place. As opposed to talking about conservation as something that, as Ciarra talks about it, is inherent, is something that is innate, and we don't teach it as that. And even at the political level, we separate it and we talk about, you know, oh, well, conservation at the expense of economics or things like that, rather than being like, long-term, if we aren't taking care of the places that are taking care of us, there will be no economics. There will be nothing else there. And so teaching from that young age, that innate respect and the reciprocity, I think it was 4 R's that Ciarra talked about, which were the perfect words for it. I've never had words to put to that feeling, but I think they are exactly what they need to be. And talking to youth about it being a state of being rather than an action. A state of mind, a way to interact with the world. And maybe conservation is not the best word for that. And I don't know that steward is either. But starting to talk about this in a way that it's not a luxury, it is absolutely a necessity for us. And not the rest of the world. You know, the rest of the world will be here. It is a necessity for us to be here.
Ciarra, will you just jump in and remind us what those 4 R's are?
Yeah, I did just put them in the chat box as well. Respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and relationships. And I just want to share a quick story about, well, a lot of our teachings come from stories. So it's not in these 4 walls in a classroom. Even as faculty, you know, we try and bring in our traditional stories because the lessons that they tie in, we don't have to sit around and talk about conservation. We're learning these 4 pillars of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and relationships. And in our beginning stories, Haniwat creator had told Coyote, it's Ciarra, you know, there's going to be a new animal coming, and they're going to be naked and clueless and really are going to need some help. And every animal came forward and said, you know, I will provide this for these helpless beings that are coming. And so that's when this relationship and this responsibility was established. The animals gave themselves for us, and then it became our responsibility to take care of them. And that's where this contract was created between us and the animals. And from that, you know, all the roots and the trees and everything else were also intertwined into that relationship. And so, you know, it's if we tell our boys these stories all the time, you know, all of these Nez Perce stories, to Twatit, these legends, and we don't have to sit here and talk about conservation. They realize, you know, oh, we need to take care of the salmon. We need to take, after we fillet our salmon, we need to take all the parts back to the river so the salmon can come back. That reciprocity, that relationship, responsibility, and respect.
Nice, thanks. Juan, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, quickly, I think the way that other movements have really garnered power has been through relationships. And so, for example, there's the movement of take your friend to vote and take your friend to this and that. And I think that is almost like directly tied to the way that conservation can grow as a movement, where we've seen it more and more on Instagram and social media, how people are posting pictures about friends going out camping and things like that. And I hear stories of, if it weren't for my friend, I wouldn't have known about this one hiking spot or about this one other place. And so if we continue to do that as an opportunity to share in relationship with other people in an outdoor space, I think we will begin to form our own memories about those places, and in turn, give a sense of a belonging and connectedness that perhaps we may have never had. And so, again, continue to invite folks to do that for each other, and to really give each other the opportunity to be a guide for someone else who may still be on an earlier journey of connecting to nature.
Nice, peer pressure. I like that. I'm also a big fan of education. You know, if we can teach people, especially kids, how just miraculous, right, and fragile these systems are, then I think that can create this sense of awe and help build love and connection. Okay, so here's a question for Jess, from Jess Johnson from Mark Norquist. Does hunting create a connection to the outdoors for you that can't be replicated by other activities? And if so, what is the story you can share to explain that?
I think the act of hunting is irreplaceable for me, and it's not so much the what I would call like the harvest, the end part of it. It's how I interact with the world around me when I am a predator, when I am paying attention to which way the wind blows and my impact on the land, whether it is my footprint over a deer's or my scent disrupting a herd of elk, or a time where I've been the secondary predator and I've been the person walking over a set of wolf prints, going the same direction as me. I've never felt more akin to something or more part of a place than I do when I hunt. And I think my first animal that I ever took, which was a mule deer buck with a bow, was a story that changed my life. It's why I went into the career that I have. It's why I have spent so much time trying to be a voice to bring other people to an experience like that, because it ignited this fire of being a part of something, not just like a community or in the people sense, but a community in the ecological sense. And being that, like, I realized that it was an immediate impact that I had on that ecology. That deer's life ended when I let that arrow loose. And I had an immense level of responsibility that like settled onto my shoulders when that happened. And it was incredible, and it was life-changing, and it was something that drove me to find out ways, whether it was, you know, working with researchers to make sure these species are around for generations down the road, or it was working to make sure that these species had a place to be around for generations down the road, so that these experiences weren't just mine, but they were those of people in the future too. And that deer is like, I could not tell you, it is something as a hunter that I think you must experience. But to take that life and to make that light go out so that yours burns a little brighter is, it's incredible and not something to ever be taken lightly.
Thank you, Jess. Oh, here's a question I like because it's literary. This is from Josh Metton. He says, what are some good examples of recreationists turned conservationists who talk about their journeys as examples of how we might bring the next generation in? So for you audience members, please go ahead and put some in the chat and I'll read those. I have a couple I'm thinking of. You know, David Brower, who founded the Sierra Club, was a member of the 10th Mountain Division. He was a skier, a soldier. He was a mountain climber, and went on to lead some of the great conservation victories of the 20th century. Of course, John Muir walked 2,000 miles from Wisconsin to Mexico and then walked all over the Ciarra before he started really eloquently, advocating on its behalf. I'd love to think of some women examples. So if our panelists or any of our audience members want to chime in there, that would be great. And then I have one that I would like to just sort of use to help wrap us up. And again, I want to bring it back for a moment to this place we are in our history, this unprecedented kind of stress we're living under, where many of us, I think, are starting to question how we lived our lives pre-pandemic. Is there an opportunity here to reassess our values and our behaviors? And I'd like to ask each of you just briefly kind of what your wish list is for moving ahead from this moment. What can we learn and take forward?
I think a slowing down of pace is something that my hope is that, we talk about conservation being a luxury, but it's also a luxury of time. We keep ourselves so busy and so preoccupied and so distracted by, what I referred to earlier as the cultural reality, with all these weights on our shoulders, whether it's bills to pay or jobs that we have to do or things just to get by, and crutches we lean on, whether it's social media for distraction or other things where even the simple act of taking your cell phone out when you're hiking detracts from the actual experience of being there. And when we keep ourselves so busy and the anxiety levels so high, we evolved in nature to be a part of nature. We did not evolve for the level of technology that bombards us on a daily basis. And it is mind-boggling to me that we're shocked that we have so much anxiety and stress and inability to focus, that we're surprised by that, because we are bombarded by it daily. And my hope would be that maybe the slowdown makes us take some breaths in between actions and think about these valuable relationships that we're missing so dearly, and the communities that have lifted each other up through really, really hard times. And maybe that breeds a little more of that respect and reciprocity.
Thank you.
Yeah, and continuing on that thread, I feel that there is so much healing to be done for ourselves after all of this happens, and also placing that experience as a way to understand perhaps the plight of other people who may not have been experiencing similar things that we have been during this last pandemic for their entire lives or generations. And so I think just empathetic about the situation that so many people are going through, understanding that accessibility to nature and to well-being isn't granted to everybody and in the same way. And I think hopefully we will have an awakening of ourselves and to greater issues that go beyond our own well-being, which I definitely feel like is important, and also in connection to everyone else. If everyone is well, then hopefully we will be well as well.
Yeah, and I think just one I guess last thought would be to really listen to the land. And for us, the story goes, the land out of which we came. We come from a monster's heart. It's a really great story. But we come from the land, and thinking about moving forward, never forgetting to listen to the land. None of us go to the doctor and don't say anything about what it is that we're needing or hurting or needing healing of. And so, we're here as stewards, caretakers, as maybe the doctor. But if we're not listening to our patient, our land, are we doing a very good job? So I think really just taking some time, there's great science out there. I'm a scientist, indicator species, but really just listening and learning what it is that we need to be doing to get on the right path.
Thank you, Ciarra. Boy, you three panelists, you were incredibly inspiring. I feel inspired. Very grateful to our audience members for joining us today. And I, just in these last few minutes, I'm going to bounce this back to Christian, who will come in and tell you what happens next. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all for being part of such a rich conversation, Florence. You've been such a critical piece of our evolution as an organization, and are thinking about the connection between public health, about our health as a species, and the health of the planet on which we reside. So I wanted to thank you specifically for that, and for conducting such a rich conversation with our emerging leaders, with Juan and Ciarra and Jess. You've been so critical to our understanding of the nuances involved in how we ensure that we have a planet that we can continue to inhabit in more of a balanced relationship moving forward. Dr. Morgan Greene, I believe, is on the call. He's the director of the Emerging Leaders Program. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to him for helping to activate the Emerging Leaders Network and bringing in people like you, like Juan and Ciarra and Jess, into the sorts of conversations that we have, so that they're relevant both to this moment in time and then the moments that are to come, and the ways that we're able to navigate if we are to have a semblance of the world that we've come to love so deeply. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. Folks, you can stay connected with us by referring back to our Shift in the Health and Nature webinar episodes on our YouTube channel. We're also sharing this out through Figshare for our friends in the research communities, and also on Slack, which is Shift Nature Health. You can continue the sorts of conversations that you've been hearing today, and we hope that you'll do so, because this conversation is one that needs all of our voices if we are to succeed. Our upcoming webinars include the next one, and this is with the Green Heart Project, which is an effort that's occurring in Louisville to essentially launch the largest randomized controlled trial in history of the health benefits of trees. And so this is with our colleague, Dr. Rooney Bhatnagar, the director of the Environment Institute, Chris Chandler, the director of urban conservation with the Nature Conservancy, and Dr. Joy Hart, executive director of the University Honors Program at the University of Louisville. That is June 9th, again from 10 to 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. On Tuesday, June 23rd, we have another conversation on urban conservation, and this is with our board member, Mickey Fern, professor of practice, North Carolina State University. He was also deputy director of National Park Service. And Alden Stoner, the executive director of Nature Sacred. So we hope that you'll join us for both of those. We have many more that are coming up in the weeks and months to come in the lead up to the Shift Summit in October. We hope that you'll join us for all of them. Again, for the seminal pieces of our Shift Summit, we have the Shift Awards. The deadline has been extended to June 5th. So if you're doing work at the intersection of nature, health, and conservation, please have a look at the Shift Awards. What we try to do with that is highlight best practices in the space that are innovative, impactful, and very importantly, replicable, so that we hope that you will nominate your work if it fits those criteria. Also, Dr. Greene is still accepting applications for the Emerging Leaders Program. You can see the sorts of conversations and rich dialogue that occurs when our community of emerging leaders is strong. I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Morgan Greene if you have interest in being part of it. And the submissions for the research abstracts for the poster session at Shift, you can give me a shout at cb@shiftjh.org. And we would love to see your work as it relates to the health benefits of time outside. So do reach out if you have research you would like to share. Thank you very much for joining us on this Tuesday morning, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar episode. Thanks so much, folks.